Its official name was the DUKW. To the American GIs in World War II, it was the Duck. This ungainly lumbering truck would never hit the headlines or win any prizes for its looks, but it had a special talent which made it a vital part of the Allied amphibious victories from Omaha Beach to Iwo Jima. The Duck could swim. Whenever there was water to cross, this machine did it. It crossed rivers. It ferried stores in harbor. It went to sea. It carried cargo. And it carried men. It did weightlifting and climbing. The only thing it couldn't do was fly, although it tried.
I don't see how you could knock the Duck anywhere it is, because there's no place that Duck's not good. I mean, there's no place you can put it that it won't work.
To me, it was a marvelous vehicle. It was a pleasure to drive it.
If you couldn't handle it, it could kill you.
You hit the beach, you're glad to be on sand. Because that ocean gets deep.
You were saying, come on, old girl. Come on. Come on, old girl. Come on, get going. Oh, yeah.
But it could also save your life.
You got the feeling you were kind of special because you were depended on by so many.
Using archive film and color reconstructions, Battle Stations tells one of the most unlikely success stories of World War II. The story of the Duck amphibian. Trying to land an army on a beach has always been one of the toughest military operations. It takes a lot of planning and a lot of luck to pull it off. During World War I, the British attempted to put an army ashore in Turkey and Gallipoli. It was a disaster. Casualties were appalling, with more than 23,000 killed and 88,000 wounded. After 9 months of clinging to a few worthless strips of sand, the British withdrew.
Gallipoli demonstrated that an amphibious assault is arguably the most difficult single operation of war. And it's particularly hard if you're coming in against a defended beach. You need some way to bridge the gap between the water and the land. Some amphibious assets which are going to help your people actually get ashore.
In the late 1930s, special infantry landing craft were developed in America. But for landing supplies, the military really needed a machine that could climb out of the water and up the beach to safety before unloading its cargo. It sounded like a good idea. The only problem was, nobody knew how to do it, and there was no great sense of urgency about finding a solution. In 1940, Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg on Western Europe. America hoped to remain neutral, but the issue was decided by the Japanese, who dreamed of imperial expansion in the Pacific. On a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, Marine Sergeant Arthur Wells was passing the time of day with a friend on board the battleship Pennsylvania at the American naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor.
We heard an explosion. Someone made the remark, well, that's just like the Army to hold gunnery practice on Sunday. And someone else yelled, the Japs are attacking.
From his battle station high on the mainmast, Arthur Wells watched as wave after wave of Japanese torpedo planes launched their low-level attack.
I could see into the cockpits. I could see the expression on the Japanese pilots' faces, and I could see the instrument panels. And then when they'd pull out, well, then I was literally eyeball to eyeball with the rear gunners. And I watched the Oklahoma roll over. I watched the West Virginia get the side torn out of her as the torpedo after torpedo hit her. so all we could do was just watch.
The Japanese attack on its Pacific fleet instantly catapulted America into World War II. Most Americans wanted to avenge the victims of Pearl Harbor. But Japan was allied with Adolf Hitler's Germany, which meant America would also have to fight a European war. The British and American allies took stock of the situation. To defeat Hitler would mean invading North Africa and mainland Europe. Germany's fascist ally Italy would also have to be attacked. A whole series of invasions would be needed to dislodge the Japanese from the island chains of the Pacific, and all these territories would have to be taken from the sea. It would mean an increasingly important role for America's elite force of seaborne soldiers, the U.S. Marines.
On street corners throughout the United States, colorful posters beckon young men to the adventure, romance, and opportunity of the Marine Corps.
I saw a picture of the Marines in the blue uniform in the drugstore, about normal tall, and I fell in love with the uniform, and that was it. I knew nothing about the Marines.
And the section of the country I came from, of course, their jobs were very few. Fact of the matter, I got $1 a month raise when I joined the Marine Corps.
Well, I grew up on a farm in eastern Colorado, and we were pretty much at home. Then I saw this big billboard that said they need another good man, and so I thought, well, I might just do that job, you know.
The recruit gets his hair cut military style and marks the first step in his transition from a civilian into a first-class fighting man.
And during boot camp, you're not a Marine, you're a boot, and that's the way they put it. It's just the training they put in you, and the tremendous skills they teach you, and you get proud. Each day it gets harder to work and harder to do it. You get more proud and you do it faster. And when you graduate from boot camp, they say, now you are a Marine, and you are a Marine.
I felt very strongly that if I could live in a beautiful country like we live in and have all the rights that we have, that it was also my obligation to defend this country if it need be.
With major amphibious operations required on every battlefront, the problem of landing an army on a beach moved to the top of the agenda. A research committee was set up by the American government to investigate new ways of fighting an amphibious war. In 1937, the racing yacht Ranger won the prestigious America's Cup. It was the work of yacht designer Rod Stevens. Early in 1942, he was asked by the Government Research Committee to help develop an amphibious vehicle for the American Army. Yacht design is all about creating elegant and streamlined hull forms that cut through the water at high speed. Now, Stevens would produce one of the slowest and least lovely vessels ever to put to sea. But it would prove to be his most important achievement and a triumph of American ingenuity.
Ever try floating a truck across water? It needs a whole platoon of men. A big tarpaulin tucked up over the sides, and she's floated across.
Rod Stevens knew that obsolete ideas like this were not going to win a modern war. He began designing a seagoing version of the standard American Army truck. In 1941, the General Motors Corporation had introduced their 2.5-tonner, a reliable six-wheel drive truck, which became the universal American supply vehicle throughout the war. GMC would eventually mass-produce some 600,000 of these trucks at the rate of one every 3 minutes.
We used to haul coal and stuff on GMC 2.5-ton trucks, and they were a workhorse. They were tough. Great engine, six-cylinder engine, but tough.
On the 30th of April, 1942, Rod Stevens and his tiny group of just 4 GMC engineers began working night and day converting a standard GMC chassis into an amphibian. They had to create a hull which would contain the engine and the drivetrain to all 6 wheels. It needed to be seaworthy, with watertight seals on all bearings. A rudder was needed to steer it in water, and, of course, a propeller to make it go. In just 38 days they had made it. The new machine was rolled out into the light of day for the first time. The strange beast had no name except its GMC code letters. They were D, indicating 1942, its year of manufacture, U for amphibian, K, front-wheel drive, and W, rear-wheel drive. The best that the American GI could make of the unpronounceable DUKW was duck. And that was the name that stuck. This machine was like nothing the Army had ever seen, and there were plenty who said it would never work. But early tests suggested they were wrong. In and out of the water, the duck performed well, and hopes were high. The design was cautiously adopted by the Army, but production would be limited to 2,000 units. The duck may have taken to water, but it soon became obvious that the military establishment had not taken to the duck. There were no immediate plans to use the amphibians or to increase the order. And as the new machines came off the production line, most went straight into store. Some generals were convinced that the amphibian would always be a compromise, neither a good boat nor a good truck. They believed it could actually become a liability on the battlefield and should not be used in combat zones.
War spawns new inventions, and they in turn demand new techniques. But the military mind is quite often conservative, and in a way rightly so, because nobody wants to take a gamble with people's lives. But the problem is this: nobody will take a new invention seriously until it's been proven in battle. But it can't get proven in battle until it's been taken seriously.
In a bid to keep the duck project afloat, Rod Stevens persuaded the Army to let him demonstrate its ability in a series of sea trials off the New England coast. It looked like his last chance to sell the idea to an unenthusiastic military establishment. 4 days before the trials, a violent storm hit the area. A Coast Guard vessel was wrecked on a sandbar offshore. When all attempts at a rescue had failed, a duck was sent out and managed to save the 7-man crew. A few hours later, the wreck had vanished. 2 days later, President Franklin Roosevelt was informed that an Army truck had gone to sea and staged the dramatic rescue of a Navy crew. It was the breakthrough that Rod Stevens needed. Suddenly, everybody, from the President down, thought his machine was a great invention and just what the Army needed.
The United States Army calls its newest mobile weapon the Duck. Amphibious 2-and-1/2-ton trucks, they operate on land or in water. Navigating rough seas like Navy barges, the Ducks are the last word in mechanized equipment.
And who better to take the duck to sea than the Marine Corps? Special duck operating companies were formed, which quickly became known as the Quack Corps, and led to some confusion in the ranks.
He says, well, I don't know anything about him, but it's a duck company. And so I asked him, I says, what the hell is the Marine Corps going to do with ducks?
In training schools along the American seaboards, men are learning how to operate and service ducks. Training is tough, but interesting. A driver must be a combination truckman, stevedore, seaman, and mechanic.
Once seated in the cab, the novice duck driver found himself surrounded by a bewildering array of levers, pedals, dials, and written instructions.
It is not difficult. It's put it in gear just like you would a car or truck. There's a lever to pull on your propeller to make it go. It was built for whatever you're going to use it for, whether it be land or sea. You didn't have to worry about where you're going. You know you'll get there.
But overconfident truck drivers soon found that going to sea was not as easy as they thought. The king of the road could soon find himself out of his depth.
My maintenance officer overloaded one of them. He overloaded this one with equipment and tools and whatnot, parts, and it went clear to the bottom of the ocean.
On land, too, the duck driver could find himself in trouble.
With the wrong tire pressure, sand is a trap, as this demonstration will clearly show. The duck on the left has tire pressure for road driving, the one on the right for sand. The hard tires make narrow, deep tracks, while the deflated tires splay out like a camel's foot, giving good traction. The driver with the hard tires might have gotten through on level ground, but now he's in a spot, with his wheels digging in deep.
But the duck had a whole range of special equipment for awkward situations, just like this one. Lesser vehicles might need the help of a tow truck, but the duck could winch itself out of trouble using a ship's anchor, also provided as part of the standard kit.
It's just simple engineering when you get down to it. It may seem complicated to some people, but in theory, most of it is simple. What you can't do, this guy can, and that just keeps going. And there's always a way, no matter what.
After 5 weeks of learning to drive, navigate, tie knots, operate winches, handle cargo, and a score of other tasks, the crews were ready to go into combat.
I was born and raised in the hills of Kentucky, and there all you saw was a horse and wagon and buggy, and I wasn't too impressed with it either. I never saw how we'd go anywhere. And when I got out of Kentucky, I could see there is a way, a new world that I never knew was out there. So that's what the Duck Company and the Marine did for me. Showed me a new world.
As they set sail for the battlefront, the crews of this novel machine were venturing into the unknown. Rod Stevens felt sure it was a winner. But the Duck had not yet proved its ability in combat, and many of the senior military chiefs still doubted if it was up to the job. Some called it a lame duck. Others said it would be a sitting duck. And a few predicted it would quickly become a dead duck. Now they would find out who was right.
It's become more and more apparent that our strategy from now on in calls for landings on lots of beaches and in lots of places. Invasion from the sea. America's fighting a modern war, so it takes the GI truck, adds a little American ingenuity, and you got the duck. The duck's in full production now, and every day more of them show up around the world.
In Great Britain, stories began to circulate among the army transport drivers of a strange new breed of vehicle. Deep in the heart of North Wales, there were reported sightings in the narrow country lanes and on the wide deserted beaches of trucks that drove straight into the waves and went out to sea. It sounded like just another wartime rumor, but driver John Geldart soon discovered it was true.
They took us out and showed us, this is what they call a duck, they said. And we thought it was a tank or sort, like, you know. And we could see the rubber wheels on it, like, you know. What is this, a wagon of some sort, like, you know. And of course, well, they told us that it goes out to sea. I couldn't believe it, like, I thought it was a wagon.
The first main memory I had is when we first went to town in North Wales for training. And that was the real time when we were introduced to the duck and what it could do, what we had to do.
As they examined their new toy, the British drivers found that every compartment and locker seemed to contain some new gadget. Clearly, this was no ordinary army truck. But like their American allies, the British soldiers soon adopted the duck and developed an affection and a growing respect for this extraordinary example of Yankee ingenuity.
Oh, fantastic, yeah, great. You were king of the road, like, huh? A fantastic invention. It was great. I've got to hand it to the Americans for that. First and foremost, we had to learn seamanship. When we were out at sea, many a time I was seasick, many a time. Most of us were.
Tides and currents could play tricks on an unwary driver, particularly when trying to mount the ramp of one of the big tank landing ships known as LSTs.
When you placed your front wheels onto the ramp, you'd find that the back, which was still afloat, would be pushed to the left and you'd be facing across the ramp, which is a bad thing to be. But you eventually got to gauge how the current was running, things like that, and enter in such a way that you ended up with your four wheels straight.
But to me, it was a marvellous vehicle. Eh? It was a pleasure to drive it.
The Duck's first combat test came with the invasion of Sicily. Now, this was designed to knock Italy out of the war and to do very serious damage to the Germans, and it brought the Allies to the very edge of mainland Europe. It was clear that much would depend not merely on getting troops ashore, but then on keeping them supplied. And this time, the Duck was in the spotlight.
The Allies planned to mount a two-pronged amphibious attack. The Americans would land in the southwest, and the British would land on the southeast coast. The invasion fleet carried more than 900 ducks to ferry men and supplies ashore. On the 10th of July 1943, the attack was launched.
While some men waded ashore, others had the pleasure of landing in ducks. They're amphibious, half-landing craft, half-lorry.
The landings mostly went well. But another new invention, the big tank landing ships, ran into serious problems. Many beached on sandbars well away from the shore. By evening, the weather was deteriorating and began to threaten the whole operation. But the ducks were able to mount a shuttle service, braving the rough seas to deliver the goods ashore. As the weather improved, the Allies secured the beachhead. But during the critical early days of the invasion, 90% of all supplies came ashore by duck. Some senior officers believed that the ducks had actually saved the entire operation from failure.
Considerably easing the supplies problem, the amphibious vehicles affectionately called ducks have delivered the goods, as required, all along the east coast advance of the 8th Army.
Once safely ashore, the ducks operated as regular army trucks, transporting troops and supplies along the narrow mountain roads. Many Sicilians saw the Allies as liberators, but the Germans put up stiff resistance and the going was tough. At last, they reached the Straits of Messina, and the ducks took to water once more, for the short swim to the Italian mainland. The battle for Sicily had been won. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, was profoundly impressed by the ducks' performance. He reported to Washington,
"Amphibious truck, 2-and-a-half-tonne, commonly called DUKW, has been invaluable. Suggest commendation for officer responsible for its development."
Nobody wanted to admit to Ike that the Army's chief contribution to the duck project had been a determined attempt to sink it. But for Rod Stevens, it was a triumph. His ugly duckling had finally won its spurs.
It's not built for beauty. It's built to take the people in, the artillery and the ammo and the stuff we did. The sick back to the ship. anything you want to put on it, you can haul. That's why it was beautiful.
With ducks to do the job of getting it ashore, it gets done in a hurry. Invasion's the order of the day, and American skill is right there to meet its requirements.
But the duck also had its share of problems. It required constant lubrication and maintenance to resist the destructive combination of salt water and sand.
The men are thoroughly grounded in maintenance work, which is highly important in a truck that goes to sea. Every vital part should be serviced at regular intervals. Every day, lubrication is checked and rechecked.
The need to stop and increase the tire pressure for road driving after a beach landing was also a major drawback.
The crew engages the tire pump, using the control in the driver's cab, and gets out the air hose. All 6 tires should register 40 pounds. Inflating and deflating as driving conditions change may take a little time, but it prevents injury to tires and keeps the driver from getting stuck. And in a combat area, that's essential.
The answer to the tire pressure problem was an ingenious system of pipes and valves which automatically fed air to the hubs of all 6 wheels from the compressor on the engine. In the cab, signs told the driver which pressures to use for a whole range of conditions. High pressure for paved highways. Lowest pressure for soft sand. Soon, the duck would be experiencing them all. From the sharp coral spikes and soft volcanic ash of the Pacific Islands to the firm sand of the Normandy beaches and the hard road to Berlin.
This is the day for which free people long have waited. This is D-Day.
At the beginning of June 1944, the Allies prepared to launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. It was the greatest amphibious operation in history. 5,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, tanks, trucks, jeeps, and 2,000 ducks. With a mixed cargo, duck driver Stanley Dobson headed for Juno Beach, 3 hours after the start of the invasion, on June the 6th, D-Day.
I'd been dropped somewhere in the region of 3-4 miles from the shore. Our ducks were all loaded up with stores, a little of each. The idea, of course, of being one of the first ducks onto the beach was that we had something for everybody. We had petrol and rations and ammunition, tank shells, things like this. We had a little bit of everything. It was amazing, I think, the organisation that went into that. Nobody told you that what it was going to be like when you got there. And I presume if they had told us what was likely to happen, we maybe wouldn't have done what we did, not take the chances and things like that, which some people did. I mean, I remember looking over the sand dunes at the time we were unloading the duck and saw the infantry actually fighting to take a cottage. I heard this, what I thought was the sound of bees, and suddenly realised it was machine gun bullets coming, whizzing over the top. You suddenly realise, oh, what am I doing here?
Until harbour facilities were established, the ducks formed a vital bridge between the supply ships and the invasion beaches. 40% of all the tonnage brought ashore was carried by duck.
The sheer scale of the Normandy operation beggars belief. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had put 130,000 men ashore in Normandy. By the end of June, they'd landed 850,000 men, 150,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies. This was a tremendous logistic undertaking. It was rather like trying to supply the population of a very small country or a decent-sized city.
It was estimated that every fighting man would need up to 30 pounds of fresh supplies every day. A ton for every 100 men. 10 tons for 1,000. Thousands of tons to shift, in boxes of every shape and size, each one labelled and listed, checked and signed for.
Canned goods, cannons, machine guns, rifles, pistols, ammunition, bombs, hand grenades, mines, mortars, uniforms, clothing, medicine, bandages, ointment, plasma, drugs.
Soon the Ducks were also performing another vital role. After unloading their cargoes, they became floating ambulances, able to evacuate the wounded straight from the battlefield to the hospital ship in one operation.
What the drivers did was pick up anyone on the shore, they'd take him there, get him aboard ship, they'd get him to the sick bay or whatever, they'd do what they could for him. A lot of people had their legs shot off, a lot of things.
For designer Rod Stevens, it had been a long, hard battle persuading the military to adopt the Duck. But by now, even the most hidebound commanders had learned to appreciate the value of the floating truck. Its versatility had been proved beyond any doubt, and its lumbering shape became a familiar and welcome sight on every battlefront.
You got the feeling you were kind of special because you knew that you were depended on by so many. I and most of the men fell in love with the thing pretty quick because it could just do so many things so well.
It's built to take the people in, the artillery in. And then now what are we going to do? We've got to have some ammo, so we got to go back to the ship, get another load of ammo and bring it back. Now we've got to have food for the men, so we got to do that. And you just constantly go back and forth. That ship is sitting out there full of everything, and if they need something heavier, they'll go get it, and that was it.
Well, I think as far as the Duck's concerned, if they hadn't had the Duck, we wouldn't have had Normandy. It's as simple as that. I don't think that the Normandy lands would have been successful without them.
On June the 12th, 6 days after the invasion, Prime Minister Winston Churchill became the first of 3 very important passengers to arrive on the Normandy beaches by Duck. Next, it was the turn of France's future president, General de Gaulle. For the French nation, his first step onto the newly liberated soil of France remains a truly historic moment. It was hardly a dignified entrance, but thanks to the Duck, at least he kept his feet dry. 2 days later, the Duck again helped to make history.
On the 16th of June, just 10 days after the opening of the invasion, His Majesty King George VI paid a visit to the fighting front in Normandy. The King went ashore in one of the now famous amphibious vehicles known as ducks.
The Duck had finally achieved the ultimate status. It really was a vehicle fit for a king. Normandy was another triumph for the amphibians, but it was not their toughest assignment. That would come on the other side of the world, in the Pacific.
No great port facilities in the savage jungle lands of the far Pacific, and barrier reefs of coral blocking off 85% of the tropical shores from boat landings. But the Ducks can ride over barrier reefs, which suggests how large a part they will play in future operations in this part of the world and elsewhere.
Pacific Islands could scarcely have been more different to Normandy beaches. Sometimes there were barrier reefs offshore. This meant that your landing craft couldn't actually get to the beach. And although the Germans always fought very hard, the Japanese fought with unprecedented ferocity. Unwounded prisoners were almost never taken. This was a very different war against a very different enemy.
The attack on Saipan was launched on June the 15th, 1944.
All the ships, as far as we could see, were shelling the land. And it was a sight that you'll never see anywhere else. It was beautiful, still it was horrifying, you know.
And that's when you're proud of the Navy, because they're blowing those people off that island. And you're just a little man down there, a little duck, and you said, I hope they get them all.
Shortly after the 1st Infantry had landed on Saipan, the Marine Corps duck crews had the dangerous task of delivering the assault artillery.
I think you fear it more when you're on ship. See, I'm going to be there in a few minutes. I got to go out there. And I see what's going on out there. I see those fish jumping out of the water, only they're not fish. They're mortar shells. And I see they're only a few inches apart. There's millions of them. And I see it's going on all the way from the beach to the ships. Well, the Japs turned loose on us with the rockets and their mortars, and the ocean got so rough you could hardly stay in your duck. And finally, you just weather the storm. The ones that don't get knocked out just go on in. And that's the way we did it. So you hit the beach, you're glad to be on sand. Because that ocean gets deep.
As the Japanese resistance intensified, the battle for Saipan grew more bitter and more deadly. The Marines suffered heavy casualties.
When we went in, you know, the first wave had already been in, and so there were obviously a lot of bodies laying everywhere, you know. I mean, it was quite a horrifying sight. But that's what war is, I guess.
You hate to see that, people, their arms and head blowing off, and that's hard to take, but you keep going.
And then them diesel ships would come in onto the shoreline, and so mixing the smell of the bodies and the diesel, I couldn't stand diesel smell for years after I got out. It was just obnoxious to me. And every time I'd smell it, I'd get the same picture of all these fellas laying there.
Out of the grime and blood of Saipan emerges America's greatest single victory in the Pacific, control of the Marianas. Saipan cost 15,000 American casualties, but the Jap garrison of 20,000 was virtually wiped out.
One Japanese survivor told his captors that it was the sight of the amphibians climbing over the barrier reefs and coming up the beaches which convinced him that the island was lost. By the start of 1945, the Americans had scored a string of victories in the Pacific. But the attack on Iwo Jima was quite unlike the others.
The largest American naval force ever assembled in the Pacific heads for one of Japan's strongest defenses, the island of Iwo Jima.
Iwo Jima is dominated by the dormant volcano Mount Suribachi. The beaches of this desert island are composed not of golden sand, but of soft, black, volcanic ash. Iwo Jima is only 660 miles from Tokyo. The American Marines were ordered to capture the island as a base for air operations against the Japanese mainland. After a heavy naval bombardment, the Marines went in just after 9 a.m. on the 19th of February 1945. As the first waves landed, there was little opposition, and it looked as if the operation might be fairly easy. But then the Japanese opened up a murderous barrage of crossfire from their well-defended positions, and the Marines were soon suffering heavy casualties. It began to look like another Gallipoli. When the ducks reached the shore, many became stranded, their wheels spinning in the soft ash.
That black sand, it was hard to breathe. That was hard on them. And you couldn't walk through it hardly. You couldn't get your vehicles through it hardly. It was tough.
Only by lowering their tire pressures to a mere 5 pounds were they able to clamber out at a few points where the beach sloped more gently. All around them, Japanese gunfire kicked up the ash, and many machines were knocked out.
And then Mount Suribachi standing there looking at you down your throat, and that was tough. It took them 3 days to get up to the top of that thing. Well, those 3 days were long and treacherous. Those men laying there just eating bullets as fast as they could. Rockets, artillery shells, everything the Japs had, they threw them at them.
At last, the summit was reached, and the American flag was raised. Iwo Jima had been won, but the experience had left many in a state of numbed shock. 6,821 Americans were dead. Of more than 20,000 Japanese defenders, barely 200 survived to be captured. The suicidal determination of the Japanese, and more horrific casualties taking the island of Okinawa, convinced the Allies that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would mean slaughter on an unacceptable scale. It was decided to unleash the ultimate weapon. On August the 6th, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. After a second bomb devastated the city of Nagasaki, a Japanese delegation boarded the American battleship Missouri and signed the formal surrender document on the 14th of August 1945. The war was over at last. The Allied victory was won by military force and mass production. It was won by the fighting machines, the tanks, battleships and bombers, and by the unarmed machines, the transport planes, trucks and landing craft. It was also won by the ingenuity, imagination and determination of men like Rod Stevens. These were the qualities which hatched his ugly duckling, which so nearly didn't make it to the battlefield, but managed to prove its critics wrong.
Without your ingenuity, where would you be? It's just something that's installed in us. And I think it's great.
The Duck, great. It was a privilege to drive it and work it. It was, I know it was under awkward times to drive it and use it, but I enjoyed it.
I don't really know how I would have done it without it, to tell you the truth. It was quite a machine.
Invasion's the order of the day, and American skill is right there to meet its requirement. So it takes the GI truck, adds a little American ingenuity, and you got the Duck.